to my right.
Excellent. While they all get settled, I'll just say thanks for joining us. Hard act to follow, but we will try. So I'm Whitney Ijem, one of the biotech analysts at Canaccord Genuity. My team and I focus on genetic medicine and rare disease companies, and very excited to be here today, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting and lively discussion. So with that, I will just turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves and maybe tell the audience a little bit about your role for those who might not be familiar.
So I'm Jim Birchenough. I'm the co-head of Biotech and Pharma Banking at Barclays. I've been in that role for the last year, banker for the last 4 years. I was a sell-side analyst for 20 years, covered 140 companies over that time, many in the cell and gene therapy space. Physician by training, practice in the US and Canada, and actually started my career 37 years ago in the Merck Research Labs and actually launched statins and ACE inhibitors in Canada. So I've seen a lot over 37 years, and a lot of things in cell and gene therapy that are in front of us I've seen before, so a lot of excitement.
Thanks so much. I'm Keith Crandell, Managing Director and a founder of Arch Venture Partners. I've been working in venture since 1986. And we're just coming through our 13th fund. We work in Europe, US, and Asia. And we're basically, I would say, following the fundamentals, which is looking for great science, kind of thinking about the point on the horizon, and then trying to build companies along those thrust lines. We've done quite a bit of work over time in the cell and gene therapy area, and also in the tools, which I think is particularly topical today as we discuss some of the progress that's being made in the area. I'm super happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Good morning. I can't think of a better way to start JP Morgan than being in the room here with you guys. ARM feels like family, and I think the work every one of you do to improve the science and health of patients is just incredible. So if anything, if there's only one thing you take away today, just keep going, because the patients need it. Kinnari Patel, I'm President, Head of R&D, and Chief Operating Officer at Rocket Pharma. I've been in cell and gene therapy for about 9 years now. We have a portfolio of 6 disclosed programs, 3 of which are AAV on cardiac diseases, monogenic cardiac diseases, and 3 are on the Lenti front. So when you talk about platform synergies, all of those fun things, it's great. I've been in the industry over 20 years in rare disease focus mostly.
Great. Lynelle Hoch. I work at Bristol Squibb. I'm the head of the cell therapy organization at Bristol Squibb, which means I am accountable across R&D, manufacturing, and commercialization for our full cell therapy portfolio. I've been at BMS for over 25 years, spent most of my career kind of in the oncology space, the immuno-oncology space, been leading the cell therapy organization at Bristol Squibb for about 3.5 years. I was brought in right after the launches to try to put us on a different track. We had learned some hard lessons that cell therapy is difficult to commercialize. You'll probably have some questions there, and we're really happy to see 3.5 years later where we are today versus where we were when we initially launched these assets. So really looking forward to the panel discussion today.
Excellent. So let's start off with the new administration that's coming in. And as we heard in Tim's presentation, every administration brings sort of challenges and opportunities, headwinds and tailwinds. So would love to hear from each of you as it relates to the kind of political environment in the new administration. What are a key opportunity or challenge that you're watching from your particular perspective? And what's the read through to CGTs? Maybe we go in reverse order. We'll start with you.
Okay, yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean, obviously, as a company, we work across the aisle and certainly planned and prepared based on whoever would be and what the administration would look like to be prepared to work to make sure we can bring innovative medicines, in the future to patients. Obviously, with any administration, there are going to be challenges. You said it as headwinds, and then there will be tailwinds. We're going to work very, very closely with this administration for things like cell therapy to make sure, for example, in IRA, are we going to make sure that CAR-Ts are seen as a plasma-derived therapy and not be bundled in to this? This is a hope and aspiration of ours, especially since CAR-Ts now are moving more into outpatient, which means they will be more of a Part B drug and will be under those scrutinies. So that will be a key area. And another area of focus will be certainly 340B pricing. It wouldn't have mattered who the administration is. This is an area a hot topic for our industry to address. So that'll be another area that we'll be looking at. But what we are excited about is this administration seems to have a bold mindset of he wants to lead in science, and he believes in innovation, and he believes on what it takes to innovate. So we do hope that we can harness that mindset to be able to forge ahead as a leader overall in cell therapy as a country, but also as an industry.
So I have, is this working? Hello?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Sorry, the prior one wasn't working. So I'm really excited because, at this point, we've been in cell and gene therapy since the first approval of 2017, having last 5 years, having 5 drugs approved at a time, right? But this year, with all the changes that Dr. Marks has made at the FDA, the collaboration they have with EMA and other aspects, I feel like administrations may come and go, right? But the core of when you think about INDs, drug approvals, I feel like the regulations, the people, and the teams have been strengthened. So I'm really excited about the fact that the momentum being built in CBER specifically and their relationship with Prime and ARMA designated programs in the EU has been really strong. So I'm looking forward to that collaboration and continuation. From a pure regulations policy perspective, I think being a rare disease company focused on pediatrics mostly, pediatric rare disease voucher program is really important. It funds innovations, and a lot of biotechs look forward to them as a way to recoup costs, as a way to develop more innovative therapies and put money back into the R&D. So I hope the efforts that ARM does, Bio and other organizations do, could help keep the momentum up in innovations in science, and especially in cell and gene therapy.
Thanks. I'm sort of expecting a little bit of confusion over the next few months, really, and I think it's sort of incumbent on the boards of the companies that are involved and also on the management to really reach out and focus on education, which I think the industry organizations, on the venture side, we kind of have the National Venture Capital Association, obviously. We're here today focused on this. And I think a reactive approach is not particularly going to be good or rewarded, so we're going to have to get out there. I do think in a way, given the progress that's been made in the industry and the some tremendous successes which have been outlined, this ought to be a much easier set of undertakings than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago. So I think there is a tremendous amount of momentum behind the industry, and I think most political groups like success, and I think this set of technologies and curative therapies offers them a tremendous amount of wins, and it's something that the U.S. overall and more broadly our collaborators globally have helped deliver. So I'm hoping that occurs. With that said, I think you have to kind of do a scenario planning thing here, because it may not come as quickly or in exactly the shape that we like. So it behooves one to kind of stay on your toes and be ready to pivot a little bit here, or look to build advocates and reinforce the success that comes from building those relationships.
Yeah, I would say on the capital market side, obviously there's a lot of focus on the macro environment and policy matters, and we're seeing some concern this morning. That being said, there is a dynamic where the sector absorbs a certain amount of risk, and a floor gets built, and it becomes asymmetric to the upside, and investors will say, we've weathered rates higher for longer, we've weathered the uncertainty of the regulatory environment, we've weathered some of the geopolitical risk, and the sector's held up. This is asymmetric to the upside, and I'm hoping this will be that year where we've had that clearing event, and we see generalist investors look ahead and say, we've weathered a lot, there's a lot of innovation happening. The second thing, I'm looking at FDA and very reassured by Peter Marks's remarks, but I heard this weekend a lot of talk about AI in different facets of drug development, but at FDA actually being used to do the mundane work that can free up reviewer time to have direct interactions on a more frequent basis with sponsors. So that's something we're watching very closely, could be a very positive dynamic.
Okay, perfect. So moving over to the funding and capital markets environment, and Keith, going to start with you. You mentioned the 13th fund. Congratulations, over $3 billion. So that's very exciting. Can you talk about, I guess, the process of raising that fund? I guess, has the discussion you're having with your investors changed over time, particularly in the context of this view that biotech is out of favor or cell and gene therapy is out of favor? Are you hearing that on your side?
I think there's certainly a question of what does Christmas future look like at this point, and how are we thinking about that? I am you can think of, by the way, if as a venture capitalist, if I'm saying something that's annoying you, you should do this, which means stop talking, or make a little circle, which means talk faster because you already know what I'm going to say. But basically, we're trying to build long-term relationships with our investor base. And in Arch, we're not a group that returns our capital in 18 months. Our average hold is about 8 years, and we tend to be thesis investors. And we're starting well over half the companies, or co-founding well over half the companies we're in, and then we're kind of in the B round, the C round, and the IPO, and in some cases even participating well after that. So the notion is we look for folks that have sort of that common interest and perspective, and then we're trying to talk about what are those kind of key, what's the currency basically to show progress. And at one point it might have been kind of being a mile wide and an inch deep and having huge pipeline. Now there's kind of the have things in the clinic and have data and show real impact for real drugs in the short term. So we're making accommodations to that. But I think the process went fairly well. This is more, in venture you kind of have the boom and you have the bust cycles, if you will. And right now we're kind of in the basement a little bit. The good news is that it's harder to fall out of the basement window. Or it's supposed to be, right?
Sounds sort of like asymmetric to the upside.
Yeah, that's what he said. Right, but I also think, many of the very best companies we've been involved in were done during the tough times. You had a little more time to study things. You're able to kind of consolidate the IP a little bit better, able to attract great management, which all these things are built on the shoulders of. And so I'm sort of optimistic that we come out of that. I think I'm not so much worried about the IPO market. I'm worried about the aftermarket because the IPO, if you build a strong syndicate, you basically can go public anytime you would like to. The question is what happens the day after, and that can be remarkably unpleasant. So one question is, how do you build that aftermarket? And some of it, historically, and again, investment bankers are going to correct me on this because I'm going to make a mistake probably, but generally, you had the specialists and then you had sort of the generalists piling in. And I think we're back to the point in some ways where the IPO process might last a week or two, and then you're back to Friday afternoon waiting on one of the 5 or 10 big players to sort of set your price. And then I think, you don't necessarily want to price to perfection. You want to go out at a reasonable number and let the market walk it up a little bit so you're kind of sharing some of that momentum. So I think new playbooks have kind of emerged. So, history doesn't repeat itself, but there are some fundamental principles there.
Right.
And the investors on the IPO side are often super important in the aftermarket because we generally distribute stock to our LPs, and if there's a very thinly traded market and you dump a bunch on there, usually that doesn't end well, particularly as well. So we have a lot of focus on how can we build the profile for the companies so that they are attractive to the general folks, and then also, are we anchored in some of the bigger institutional accounts where the PMs can talk to their buddies down the hall and pile in for some additional purchasing.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, that's helpful, and a good segue to the IPO market. Jim, just disagree with whatever you think you should with what he said, but no, what's your view on the IPO market headed into 2025? And it's a good point, the aftermarket as well.
Yeah, it's I'm Canadian, so I have to make a reference to the hockey stick and say that when this does turn, it's going to turn quickly and it's going to hockey stick. But we went from 11 IPOs in 23 to 17 last year. And we had windows open up, and it felt like, engines getting going, and then the macro environment intervened, but it felt like a market that wants to run. And so I feel like this year we're going to have an uptick in IPOs. I think, best guess, I'm going to say 30 plus. And I say that because there's 3 or so that we expect to go at around JP Morgan. There's another 5 or 6 that are going to follow closely. One of those we're involved with, that's a cell therapy early clinical. So in February, we'll get a sense of how the market is looking at early clinical cell therapy. And I think we're going to have a few tests of the market this year. So if the market's not ready in the first half of the year, I think we're going to test it in the mid-year and post-Labor Day like we did last year. And I think ultimately we're going to get there. And you know, it's a good comment that Keith made. You can go public any time, but should you? And there's a lot of companies that went public that weren't ready to be public companies. And when we advise companies on IPOing and thinking about turning platforms to pipelines, you know, our advice is you want to have your program funded, if you're thinking about the public markets, past your value inflection point. Ideally 12 to 18 months of cash. And we get a lot of presentations of companies that have enough cash to get to something, but the what's next is left out. And so I think the more companies that can have that thinking of our long-range planning contemplates cushion, so that when we IPO with a story that's sustainable beyond the IPO. I think that's going to be really important. I see companies thinking that way, so I feel pretty good about the IPO market this year.
Okay, awesome. And then just to expand on that a little bit, and something that Jim touched on, the IPO, great, the aftermarket, all right. So how do you position a company well for better performance in the aftermarket? You touched on it a little bit, I think, with cash position relative to catalyst timing. But can you speak to that, and in the context of what will it take to bring the generalist investors back to kind of help that aftermarket performance?
You know, we saw some examples last year of some genetic medicines companies that were platform companies progress their capital base from healthcare specialists to generalists. And I'll call it Avidity as an example, where an antibody oligo conjugate approach to delivering oligos to muscles actually connected the dots for investors from a target knockdown, preclinical data that translates well, early biomarkers, established natural history, some alignment with FDA on clinical endpoints, and they connected those dots. And as they connected the dots, we saw the specialists get added to with the generalists. And I think you need to do that. And as we think about what's IPOable, it's really about connecting those dots. And some dots can be connected earlier from that basic science understanding, the target biology, the preclinical models, the early surrogates, how they translate into clinical benefit. And one of the things that's been missing is, to the extent cell and gene therapy is a paradigm shift, understanding how that's going to work, how that paradigm's actually going to shift. I get investors asking me all the time on cell and gene therapy, but how's this going to work? Which physician's going to take ownership for this patient? How's it going to integrate into current practice patterns? And I think that's something where, as I think about what's IPOable, it's companies that can not just do the scientific translatability, but the commercial translatability as well.
All right, we're going to come back to the commercial translatability. And Lynelle, you're right, I will pick on you a little bit. But first, Kinnari, curious to hear your view. Rocket just closed a deal as well, so congratulations on that. Having been a part of several raises now, I guess curious your views on that process. Again, have the types of investors you're talking to changed, or the types of questions or the level of detail you're getting questions on changed?
Yeah. At Rocket, we've been very fortunate that most of our investors have been with us for the entire duration. And we've had a little bit of turnover, but not that much. I think what was really cool is we were trying to raise a small amount just to bridge, given the market's uncertainty for this year. And what we saw is there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of money on the sideline, and investors are waiting for the story. So I think the difference I saw in this raise versus other raises, we had our top investors come in and say, okay, what do you need to bridge to your top line data of Danon program? Tell us what you need and raise more. Right? So that was a great advice. Just take more money, which means sometimes, for publicly traded companies with current shareholder, you're trying to do a calculation of dilution and how much you need to take to bridge to X, Y, and Z. But the focus was really threefold. It's not just about the basic science and disease understanding. It's what will your product have clinical impact, and what's your clinical proof of concept. And then it's bridging it all the way to when you commercialize, what is the epidemiology? How many patients will be there the first year, and how many patients will be there in the peak sales? So when you're ready to go and raise money, I think thinking about the whole story and not just where you are preclinically or commercially is going to be really critical. And the other component that's very helpful is when you have spend time transparently bringing all of your investors along, right? It really makes it a lot easier. So all of our investors, we meet so often in so many bankers and investor conferences, and we share with them, here are the challenges. We're executing, we're focusing on X, Y, and Z. Here's what we're prioritizing on. So bringing that along when you have the trigger for the raise, it makes it a lot easier, a lot faster, and within a day or two of 50 plus meetings, you end up getting the checks that you need with the investors you want, which is always nice.
Checks that you need from investors you want. That last part is critical as well, as we've heard. So moving over to, I guess, the other way that money flows into the space on the M&A and deal flow side, Jim, as Tim talked about in his presentation, we've started to see some higher value deals, Poseida and Kate, in addition to others. So as you interact with biopharma companies, acquirers, curious if you're getting the sense that they're watching the valuations too, that valuations have reached this point that are just so compelling we're going to see an uptick.
Yeah, my view on this is that I haven't seen pharma bargain shopping, and I've seen more paying a premium for certainty. And one of the dynamics is we're kind of in an opposite dynamic that we were a few years ago, where valuations were sky high for nice PowerPoint presentations, and the price to value wasn't really that attractive. I think now the opposite is, it's really undervalued, but it creates a dynamic where pharma might say, they'll look at valuations and say, what are we missing? It kind of reinforces biases. So on the banking side, I find myself actually challenging fixed biases that are based in part on people looking at stock prices. And the other part of it is it takes away the FOMO, where the pharma doesn't feel like things are going to run away from them. They've got time. Why do we need to do this now? And one of the things that I think will happen this year is, as we recover, what we've seen as we've plotted these recoveries historically over the last 30 years, as you get the recovery, the M&A activity picks up, because that's when the FOMO kicks in.
Okay, Lynelle, then over to you. When is the FOMO coming? No, I'm just kidding. But as the big biopharma representative here, I'm curious to hear your perspective.
I think it's really, really well said. I mean, I think for BMS, who obviously we have at the core of our strategy is partnering in this ecosystem. We do not think pioneering cell therapy is one that a company can do alone, even as you build up capabilities. So we will continue to look for in-licensing, partnering opportunities, and bolt-on technologies as our mainstay. But I agree with you. We're not looking for bargain price sales. We're looking for best-in-class technologies, assets, et cetera, that can either accelerate our current portfolio or be very transformational, be in a best-in-class, first-in-class position. So while the prices are low, it's interesting. It almost makes us be a bit more critical about what is it we're looking at. Is it going to accentuate what we already have, accelerate something, or really be a best-in-class? A good example of a bolt-on we did was Solaris. I mean, I think for us it was, we have a really rich pipeline, and we're very happy with our cell therapy pipeline and what it can do, not just in hematologic malignancies, but what it can do in autoimmune and potentially onto solid tumor. But what we really needed was some bolt-on technology on being able to scale and be able to automatize the overall manual process that cell therapy is, and Solaris gave us that. We've also bolted on gene editing technology as we think about solid tumor and the tumor microenvironment, and so we really felt like Prime had the best-in-class gene editing technology. So what we're always looking for is, where is it that someone can be providing us something we don't have, either a best-in-class, first-in-class, and we continue to do that. We're not looking for big M&A at this point. We're kind of looking for, as I said, bolt-ons at this point.
Got it. Okay. So moving over to another hot topic in the space is regulatory. We obviously just heard from Dr. Marks. So Kinnari, I'll start with you. I guess having interacted with regulatory agencies in the U.S. And ex-U.S. on both AAV and lentiviral cell therapy programs, curious to hear your perspective on, where has there been a lot of advancement and progress with the regulators, and where might there still be room for improvement, shall we say?
I have to say, since Dr. Nicole Verdun came on about 2-ish years ago, or almost 2 years ago, what I really appreciated is it's almost everything, every meeting request you ask for, you get granted or you get an answer, right? Everything is kind of happening like a clockwork, which is great for us as industry in cell and gene therapy. There are a lot of uncertainties, and there are not that many guidances out there. There are not that many precedents out there. So to being able to interact with health authority every step of the way, transparently asking them questions and getting guidance is really critical to our success. And I think the other component, look at all of you being in the room. The value of being in person is huge, right? So I really appreciate that FDA started doing in-person meetings instead of just TCs and video conferences. That has really helped collaboration. And I think the third component that has been valuable is, in the last 1 year, both the EMA and the FDA do monthly telecons in CBER for every product that's Prime and RMAT designated. they work on it together. So that has been really great for us, for Rocket. What we do is usually we do preclinical in-house in Cranberry, New Jersey, near Princeton. And we do all of our clinical phase 1 data, which is proof of concept, as well as dose escalation, et cetera, for AAV, really in the US. But based on our US promising data, we expand very quickly into UK, Europe, and US. So having those collaborative meetings where we have one design, for example, for Danon disease, 12-patient study with the 1-year data readout, and that same study serving as a full approval pathway, agreed by the both EMA, FDA, and MHRA at the same time, because they were already talking about the disease amongst each other and granting the interactions and attending each other's meetings, just made things a lot more efficient. Because in the biotech industry, right, in R&D, to increase productivity, especially in limited resource time, you need to be efficient with your time and energy. So I think I really appreciated those progresses that have been made. Some of the things I think I look forward to in the future for changing is there's regulatory flexibility in the clinical front. CMC front, we're not there yet. So having more CMC standards, more CMC flexibility being bestowed in cell and gene therapy is something that I'm really keen and focused on. And I know a lot of the ARM board members that I work with are very interested in helping as a nonprofit organization, helping the agency get there. So I think whatever we can do to collaborate together through these working groups will be great.
Okay, got it. And Lynelle, anything different on the CAR-T oncology side?
What I would say is, and to actually complement what was just said, was I really have been energized over probably the last 12 months. If I was to go back when we were first launched, the rigidness of interpretation of specifications, the rigidness of the process is the product, has really evolved. And I think that they've recognized that data should inform the evolution of cell and gene therapy, just like they ask us for data. We are all learning. So when you're pioneering a new field, your thoughts and what they were 3 years ago should change 3 years later. It's good to see the FDA is evolving on that front, particularly as you articulated. CMC has been on a journey. It's moving in the right direction. I think we need to accelerate more. But I also have to say we were super energized. Some of the fastest INDs we've ever done was in autoimmune. Now, we were really curious. I mean, this is going into a disease area where the safety hurdles were going to be super high. It was going to be interesting to see the FDA's response, and they decided to put CBER on the front end of the cell therapy reviews, not CDER, which was a very good move for our industry, because if we had to go through CDER with a cell and gene therapy into autoimmune, it would have been a very different IND process. And I think we also think it bodes well, and Peter Marks himself said this in another forum, that they're willing to entertain single-arm trials for autoimmune. I mean, this would have been unheard of in the CDER realm in autoimmune. And this is really, really exciting for us. So I am encouraged on the path we are on right now from a regulatory front, but do agree if CMC can move as fast as they are on the other fronts, I think we'd be in a great spot.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. And then something Dr. Marks talked about today, and we were hearing more about, is this platform designation as well. So Kinnari, again, curious to hear your perspective, like where are we on that? How far do we have to go? And kind of what could that mean for the field, rather, if that comes to fruition?
This is an exciting topic. Last 3 years, I've been in a lot of panels with Dr. Marks talking about platform approaches, because I really believe that instead of doing one drug at a time, to get 10, 20, dozens of drugs at a time, platform approach is so critical. For Rocket, we have AAV platform and ex vivo lenti, and I kind of see that when I take a step back from each of the platforms, there are so many synergies there. So to me, being able to apply broadly than the guidance that came out last year, FDA is willing to. So starting conversations about platforms saying, hey, if I'm doing monogenic cardiac gene therapy using AAV technology for one disease, which is already in pivotal, and I have a pre-IND and a phase 1, what are the synergies I can do if it's the same manufacturing facility, same scale, pretty much everything's the same except the transgene. So having that ability to, in the future, synergize so every single product we get to the market doesn't have to go through this huge rigor and resource intensiveness, from raw material testing to all of the PPQs and all of the complexities and time and things needed, I think would be great. Because here's the thing, what we're solving for. These diseases that we all work on, the urgency is really real. When you find out that patients are passing away because they have no treatment option, perfecting each one of them individually over and over feels like a waste of resources, and we're not doing right by the patients and the science. So to me, I'm really excited that in the future, as people start having more conversations, there'll be hopefully precedence on platforms, because that could really accelerate what we do.
Okay. And Keith and Jim, curious to hear your perspective, because platform has almost become a dirty word from an investor perspective, and I think you both kind of touched on this. So is that changing as we start to hear more about the FDA talking about platform, or will that change? And could that, how would that impact how you're talking to and building companies?
Well, I think everybody wants a platform, they just don't want to pay for it, right? So I think that argues for sort of efficiency, if you will. And I sort of view platform as relatively broad, so not just the manufacturing platform or the tech development, but your regulatory platform as well. And I'm actually pretty encouraged on that. We had a company, Arbor, that just got through the IND process in, I think, 27 days. And I certainly attribute to the strength of the crew there, kind of shoveling the coal into the furnace. But at the same time, if it's not matched by receptivity, that can work out poorly. But I think we're also at a point where there's sort of the sizzle and the steak, and you have to have the first step on the stairway to success more or less nailed down. And because things, especially in newer technologies, almost always take longer and are harder than you would expect, I think the sector, and not just biotech, but even healthcare, is kind of out of fashion right now. So I think it's a trust-building exercise where we have to show some successes. I wish to me, the larger companies during these kind of downturn periods should be jumping in to sort of capture that, or you would think that would be the case. But I think, has been pointed out, they're more or less, tapping the brakes during that period. So I don't expect that to sort of rescue the category. I think it's going to be in the clinic with the drugs that work. And as these indications get larger and larger, I mean, they literally affect every man, woman, child, and their dog or pet, as the case may be. And that's the type of thing that drives the public awareness, which I think starts the kind of virtuous cycle of helping with the general investors, because they know that this is something that's super important. So to some degree, we're paying the butcher bill for this rare diseases, because there's relatively few people that are, even though they need it, even though it's dramatic, it's not something where everybody knows someone who had a positive outcome. I think as that broadens, that becomes kind of a virtuous cycle, and I think we're on the cusp of that here in the next couple of years, and that should drive things forward.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I've in covering the sector for 25 years, I've seen platform come in and out of vogue. And there was a point in time where platform companies got a premium valuation because there was an engine of productivity to drive future growth. And where if you were a single asset company, that was a finite DCF. And I think we're going to get back there. And I think the key is actually the use case that you choose to support your platform, and choosing use cases that really show that you're doing something with your platform that others couldn't otherwise do, that creates value. And there's been companies across different categories that have done that. I think looking at the case studies of other companies that have done platforms well, and I'll throw it Ascendis as an example. It's transcon delivery of different proteins and peptides, but their first use case was human growth hormone, and they did something no one else had done. No one could do a weekly growth hormone that was as good or better than a daily, but they did it. And they got credit for that opportunity, and then they did it a second time with PTH, and then people were investing in them for their second and third pillars. And so I think the way you construct a pipeline off of a platform is really key. I'm starting to get investors to ask me about single product opportunities. What's my backstop if this doesn't work out? And the answer is there's none, because there's nothing behind it. So I think there's a lot of value in platforms. And again, I think you want to construct the pipeline with cushion, and I think you want to be careful in your selection of your use case.
Okay, wise words. So important in this platform discussion is the manufacturing. So, Lynelle, over to you, and on the kind of CAR-T side of things, where are we in this journey towards standardization and optimization of COGS, really, on the cell therapy side? And how have things changed, I guess, since the first approvals in 2017?
Yeah, listen, if you look at all the CAR-T companies who initially launched, we all struggled with being able to scale. We struggled with the heterogeneous nature of a living therapy, and being able to have high manufacturing success rates would prove to be more challenging than clinical. Some of that had to do with, as I articulated, the tighter specifications through the CMC labels than were required for our clinical trial execution. So there was a lot of confounding issues that made manufacturing complex, slow, and expensive, and not at scale. All the nightmares of a pharmaceutical company, right? So we have now advanced 3.5 years later, and you can see almost two of the bigger companies that have gotten in cell therapy, they have done their homework to be able to increase their manufacturing success rates, to be able to drive down the number of humans, labor involved in the autologous cell therapy. And then the third thing that we're all moving very quickly to is automation. And because the FDA has opened the door, that while yes, the process is the product, as long as you can show some level of analytical comparability, you can move some of your unit operation into automation. Versus when we first launched these drugs, it was basically you will live with this process till that product is no longer, and you can make no changes because it is the product. Now, or repeat your whole clinical program, and which is obviously not as cost prohibitive if you're not doing that. Now we have the door open. So what I would say is we are light years from where we were. And I think you're going to see the velocity even accelerate more, because as we now have started to tap into AI, et cetera, where you can actually automate critical things in QC, automate critical things in your manufacturing process, I think you're going to start seeing autologous cell therapy be one where not only can it scale and do it at a lower cost base, you're going to be able to see that it's done with a very high precise manufacturing success rate. Because we have to remember, when you don't have a good manufacturing success rate, it isn't just you don't get reimbursed for that. You have reams of deviations that you have to work through, which is additional labor. It's like compounding. So your ability to be precise across the board is super, super helpful. So I do think we have come a long way, and I think you're going to see COGS continue to decline. You're not going to be a biologic, though. I mean, I always try to tell people that say, well, you're going to have a biologic like gross margin. Not until you get to an off-the-shelf solution. And even allo will not be a biologic like gross margin. You have to get almost to in vivo strategies, et cetera, before you get to truly biologic. But we also have to remember we have a different pricing dynamic. Where, again, back to price volume, I think cell therapies have a different dynamic there that are in our favor, assuming you can get that cost of goods down to a place where you can live with the gross margins. And so I think we're on a different trajectory now, is what I would say.
Okay. And Kinnari, same question to you on the AAV side. Where are we and how have things evolved?
So we decided to bring AAV in-house because in vivo, similar to biologics, we want to control the quality of the costs, but also the speed. So we built out a pilot program so our preclinical assets could be designed from vector to scalability and to take to commercial scale in-house already. So being able to have that control, a lot of biotech executives are like, when do we build our own facility? And I saw the swing in the last 10 years where no one had it in-house, then everyone went to in-house, then sold pennies on dollars, and then, the pendulum swings. I think it depends. It depends on how many products do you have. It depends if you have one product, what's the volume that you need and how much control do you need and what kind of funding do you have investment in? So for us, based on that, we decided that ex vivo lenti, where we started the company based on, they were already commercial grade CDMOs that had a lot of experience. And because of the volumes, we said, let's just keep it as CDMO. But what we did is we synergized. As a small biotech, to have a negotiation power and flexibility, we said all three of our ex vivo lenti will be produced at the same vector manufacturer, same cell processing, same analytics centralized across the board. But for AAV, when we brought it in-house, what we realized is we can go in and out of our clean rooms across all three of our AAV programs. And I think that has been really valuable. It comes with complexities, of course, of maintaining, getting through EMA, FDA inspections. But I think to me, as a regulator at heart, that's the fun part, right? You can control your destiny and the time. And I believe that overall, we've seen in the industry that it's gone from scale of 800-liter suspension, all the way to 2,000 liters. So full empty ratios being higher, you have a more potent, better quality product, and hopefully overall, when you think about CMC to clinical, it bridges to a better safety profile, which is something that people are working on. How do we manage safety initially, you see? And what I keep saying is, hey, CMC and clinical has to be integrated all together. And one of the things at Rocket we did is we have everyone in-house in one place. So our clinical colleagues and our manufacturing team members all get to meet with the patients and interact that, hey, when you do a QC test here, this product will be released and given to this patient that's going to be. So having that integration across the company helps really understand the impact of CMC needs to be hand in hand with clinical, especially when you have a phase 1 to phase 2 or pivotal study going to commercialization very quickly. So to me, that's kind of the process that we have. There's no one way of fitting it. It just have to depend on the disease, the company, and the resources you have available.
That's helpful. Okay, so in the last 10 or so minutes here, we're going to move over to the commercial side. And so, Lynelle, as you alluded to earlier, I think some of the cell and gene therapy launches have been proceeding more slowly, definitely than was expected on the investor side. But I think there's the impression is that it's also kind of slower than some of the companies themselves thought. So do we agree, disagree? And I guess, have there been any surprises or unknowns that have popped up along the way that have kind of led to that?
Listen, I think that when you're pioneering a new field, there's some inherent level of complexity one would expect, and the uptakes might look vastly different. I think we would say that it certainly has more complexities than maybe people might have thought on the surface. I'll give you an example. Like, so you think about CAR T. I don't think anyone's going to argue that the efficacy results are transformational. With a one-time infusion, you are taking people's lives from being reminded they are a patient to they are a person again. I mean, it is transformational. And if you look at kind of class uptakes of analogs of similar transformational nature, I go to PD-1, so sorry, from my IO days, which I led the US business when we were launching Opdivo into a myriad of indications, every uptake was about 6 months. You would see this rocket ship trajectory. And now you look at CAR Ts, and we are not. We are a slow, steady, almost like a cardiovascular launch, right? And the reason we think that is because there's more in the ecosystem that you're relying on. It isn't just put transformational efficacy out there, show that you can cure patients, and they will come. The Field of Dreams did not kind of show up that way. And what we have seen is you need a lot of things in the ecosystem to work. First, we had to figure out our manufacturing, but we knew that with money and resources and capabilities, we could do that, and that's proven to be true. What has become more challenging is the ecosystem, both on how physicians are paid, as well as the ecosystem on how a patient is handed off between an academic center back to the community, which Peter Marks alluded to. All of that has become a lot more of a factor in does a patient sign up for a CAR T or not. When you have requirements in a label that says for all CAR Ts, you have to be 4 weeks at an academic center with a treatment, a caregiver, I should say, and 8 weeks of not driving, it is cost prohibitive. It's not the price of the drug. The drugs are getting reimbursed. But you tell a patient, I'm going to have you and a loved one for 4 weeks at an academic center, could be 6-8 hours away from home, and that you have to not drive for 8 weeks. This is a huge rate limiter. So we've been in a lot of discussions with the FDA. We've got to change that. 99% of all talks for CAR Ts happen in the first 2 weeks. They should be at the CAR T centers for 2 weeks and then shipped back to the community. Number two, community practices should not be getting FACT accredited. And I'm probably going to get, someone's going to taser me in the room who works with FACT. But it's not a transplant. CAR Ts are not a transplant. It has a different efficacy and safety profile. It should be treated as such. We have very rigorous process by which we onboard. And I'm really happy to say that in 24, we had the very first community practices treating CAR T in the community. Virginia Oncology was one of our fastest growing CAR T centers. Tennessee Oncology, Florida Cancer is looking to come on board, so is Texas Oncology. If these folks can figure out how to treat some of the most toxic oncology products, they can deliver CAR T. They just had to figure out the economics and how they get reimbursed because, as one of them had said, which I won't say who, no margin, no mission lady. I said, listen, I'm right with you. We've got to be able to figure out the economics because they've got to be able to pay the bill. So I do think it has been slower, But we are right now at the tipping point. Now I do believe that people have figured out these are tremendously transformational modalities, that if you can figure out the economics and you can figure out how you get these people closer to home in their community where they want to be cared for, I do think you'll start seeing really significant uptake, and I do start to see the ecosystem coming together to make that happen.
Okay, so on the tipping point, that's exciting. In the oncology space, I assume that's what you mean. On the back of really positive data, phase 1 data in the autoimmune side, how do you start to think about the manufacturing and commercialization challenges in that type of setting, which is a whole different sort of epidemiologic and sort of dispersion profile?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I say to people all the time in-house as well, you know, when we saw our initial data for CD19 XT, I mean, people wept at our company. I mean, you're talking about young women in their 30s, potentially robbed of their lives, completely off all immunosuppressive drugs, and back to living their lives very differently. Now, how durable these will be when we move them into pivotal, whether we'll still get the same results, I don't know. But when we saw our first, you know, handful of patients, I mean, it was just an emotional set of moments at the company. But we also recognize we're going from, we initially launched into hematologic malignancies and we struggled with scale. Now you're talking 10 to 15-fold the size of the population, even in severe lupus. You're talking about a population about 54,000. You compare that to diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, you're talking about 12,000. You're seeing huge scale. So the first thing you have to do is you have to be fully automated at launch. You cannot. And actually, you have to be fully automated as you go into pivotal because you do not want to be changing in flight. So that's a lesson learned from a regulatory standpoint. So you've got to be automated. Number two, this has got to be treated in the community out of the chute. You've got to be bringing a rheumatologist on board right away and as part of your pivotal plan. It cannot be only treated by heme oncs. That will not be something that will allow you to open the coffers initially, but it will be hard to do. I don't want to make it sound like it's going to be all roses and sunshine, but I will say I do think you get lots of motivation from the community when you see the transformational results and the impact it can have on patients. And so I do think we need to get those two things right. We need to get it into the community as quickly as possible. We need to automate.
Okay, and Kinnari, preparing to commercialize on the cell therapy side and AAV, curious your thoughts.
Yeah, for us, because all of our therapies, or at least most of our therapies, were the first and only ones being developed. And unfortunately, these patients, only alternative option they have is they pass away, or if they're lucky, they get a heart transplant or a bone marrow transplant. So when we think about that, our big thing is, from the beginning, from a pre-IND stages, we want to spend time with the patients and treating physicians to understand what is important to them. Because that value-based pricing and the value-based endpoint data collection is really important. And as you head to phase 1, going to pivotal, it's about CMC coming along, but it's also about your commercial colleagues. And it's also about thinking about, hey, most of these diseases are not well understood. You may not have an ICD-10 code. You may not have genetic testing available. So a lot of the things we did at Rocket in the last few years is put ICD-10 codes for the disease we work on. So at least we can collect more real-time data, and it's not just an extrapolation from transplant data. And the second thing that has been helpful is bringing along the payer conversations early on, saying, here's our phase 1 data. What additional information do you need on durability? What do you need for safety? And bringing those conversations in a very integrated fashion. I love the word Lynelle used, ecosystem. The ecosystem has to come along, and the genetic testing. So we've partnered with Reddy and a few other organizations in order to make genetic testing available and free for patients. Because what we realize is, unfortunately, when we find a patient, yes, there might be some patients that are just de novo patients, but unfortunately, many family members are impacted by the same disease. So being able to identify them early as possible so we can get them into the funnel, whether it's natural history or registry, so by the time we launch, if the therapy is available, the patients are waiting, and hopefully the payers come along, is really, really critical. And there are some unique challenges with ex vivo lenti needing QTC centers that are trained. On AAV side, I think 2 to 4 weeks, whatever safety you're going to see is it, essentially, from core gene therapy and supportive therapy. So how do we get all of the centers to know how do you prevent things like TMA? And how do you get over that hurdle so you can see the durability and the efficacy in the life-changing therapies? So to me, commercialization is not an afterthought, just like CMC is not. We really have to bring that along early in drug development, and I think that's the way to success. Because we are all working for one goal, is to change patient lives, and that's not just in a clinical front, but it's really to make therapies available where patients need it around the world as quickly as possible to as many patients as possible. So to me, that's how kind of we're thinking about it at Rocket.
Okay, got it. In the last 2 minutes then, kind of a question for the entire panel and bringing it back to the title of the talk, which is focused on capital markets and commercialization, and hopefully on a positive note. So curious, related to either of those two topics, kind of what's one key takeaway or one kind of key opportunity for the cell and gene therapy space in particular that you'd either review that we already talked about or that you'd highlight just as kind of a parting comment. So starting with you.
Yeah, we had the launch last year, the first TIL therapeutic, and it's going to do maybe $500 million in sales this year. And they gave a lot of thought to how this was going to work, and that's reassuring to me. And I look at cell and gene therapy having the most profound and predictable impact on disease, and I think the storytelling is really important and understanding the end market really early. I don't see enough of that. So I think we've got a great opportunity in front of us, a lot of white space, and understand your end markets.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go down a level, which is just to compare the manufacturing piece, which is, kind of as a reformed semiconductor photonics person, every molecule that you put together in a semiconductor was QC'd at some point. The physics are understood. You can have talks with semiconductor people about quantum effects and so forth. We're not there yet on the biology side, but I think that's the mentality that's going to take to really solve the QC piece of this. It can't be end pipe, lactate, and it's got to be really understanding the major constituents and the minor constituents. And I think that will indeed open up the immunology piece of this and the less than kind of acute problems. So I'm going to, normally, if this was a restaurant, I'd be standing on the table and shaking my fist on that point. I also think, in the semiconductor industry, you see the executives leading the organizations that came up through manufacturing. On the biotech side, you don't really see that. It's usually the clinical folks that are leading. So I think that's something to think about as you're populating the senior levels of management.
For Rocket, I'm really excited that we're moving from R&D, hopefully, to commercialization of hopefully 2 products in the next 12 to 18 months across the US and Europe, which would be great. But as a whole, stepping back, Tim's presentation was so impressive, right? We have a lot of room to be excited. The science is great. The impact is wonderful. And we've seen the hurdles. But you know what I love about this industry of cell and gene? It's we all come together and help each other and learn from each other's successes and each other's mistakes. And I think that perseverance that the team here has and everybody working in cell and gene is just phenomenal. So I'm really excited not just to have 5 drugs hopefully approved, but 10, 15, 20 every year and moving upwards and onwards. And as a company that just raised money, having more IPOs come through, having more fundings come through. I mean, it's been 4 years of bear market, so we're ready for some good news. I'm hoping it happens this year finally. So.
Maybe I'll just bolt on to a lot of what's been said. I do think we're at a very interesting inflection point as a field in cell and gene therapy, and I do think that we'll see the tides turn where people are going to continue to see this transformational efficacy that they're not seeing with other modalities. There is a definite difference, and the benefit to a patient in a one-time infusion shouldn't be looked at as a bad thing when it comes to the investor side of things. And I do think that the more we can pull this into the community, which I do see the momentum it started in 24, and the more we see it move into other disease areas like solid tumor, like autoimmune disorders, you're going to start seeing more of this groundswell of excitement build, and I think you'll then start seeing investors come back in, and you'll see more deals being done, et cetera. So I'm optimistic 25 is going to be a really exciting year of data readouts, investments coming back, et cetera.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for your time, and thank you all as well.